Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hi, welcome to the Independent Women's Forum podcast. I'm Inez Stettman, Senior Policy Analyst here at IWS, and I have with me Carrie Lucas, our President and Fearless Leader, to talk to you about a bill you might have been hearing about lately, the Paycheck Fairness Act. Thanks for being here, Carrie.
Thanks so much, Inez.
Let's get things started with the basics. Can you explain exactly what the Paycheck Fairness Act is, what it does, and what the potential consequences might be?
Sure. It's interesting with the Paycheck Fairness Act. I think it's important to talk first about what this bill isn't, because some of the rhetoric around the bill is very different than what it is in reality. When you hear people talk about the Paycheck Fairness Act, they talk about it as if this is legislation to protect, to ward against discrimination, that this is equal pay, same pay for same jobs, men and women in the same positions have to be paid the same. And of course, everybody hearing that applauds and says, yes, it's about time, except that it's not about time. That's been the law of the land for decades now. Discrimination on gender-based discrimination has been illegal, was made illegal in the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and then again in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Employers are already forbidden for discriminating or paying women less than men for doing the same jobs. And in fact, that's just the beginning. You think back to when President Obama was in office, the very first legislation he signed was the Lilly Ledbetter Act, and this was another one that was heralded under as if it was the finally equal pay for equal work, and it was a big push. It was well celebrated because it was considered another big step forward for women. Again, under this idea of closing the wage gap and protecting women from discrimination. But here we are again, and there's a call for more legislation. And what this legislation is it isn't protecting equal pay. It's basically just changing how discrimination or how lawsuits proceed that are claims against discrimination. So it's basically to make it a lot easier for employees to sue, to make it harder for employers to defend against themselves, and to increase the number of class action suits. So this is much better understood as legal reform and really favoring more lawsuits and the plaintiffs in legal cases. It's really not about that core fundamental idea of equal pay for equal work.
So Congresswoman Alexandra Cortos disagrees with you. She's been one of the ladies on the forefront touting the Paycheck Fairness Act, and she says not only will it help close that pay gap that you mentioned, but it's time to, quote, pay women what they're worth, not what they're desperate enough to accept. So how do you respond to the Congresswoman? How do you respond to people who say, look at this massive pay gap of 23 cents on the dollar, women only make 77 cents on the dollar compared to men? How can this possibly be fair? We have to change this.
Yeah, it's important to, I think, anytime we're talking about equal pay, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the wage gap, because that really is that fundamental question and thing. People are very frustrated. You hear all the time this idea that women are paid less for equal work, and hear the statistic. But again, statistics are only useful if you really dig in and understand exactly what they're talking about. And the wage gap statistic is it's created by the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it compares the average wages of a full-time female worker to the average wages of a full-time male worker. And it doesn't control for years of experience, for industry, for specialty, and even, this is, I think, one that surprises people most, for numbers of hours worked. A full-time worker is technically anybody who's working over, I think it's 36 hours is the threshold. And the average person who is considered a full-time worker is the average woman works about a half an hour less in the office or at her job a day than the average man. So right there, you have, it shouldn't surprise anybody that if you're working a half an hour less a day, or, that adds up to, it ends up being about 8% of all of work time. So that explains almost a third of the wage gap, more than a third of the wage gap in that one statistic on the number of hours worked. But then again, we also have things like the specialties And it's important I feel like when we talk about the wage gap and we talk about the difference in men and women's earnings, there's this almost, I think, cartoonish image that, men are all sitting there and they're in suits and sitting in boardrooms, smoking cigars and getting paid more than their female counterparts. And that's what drives the wage gap. Well, in fact, when you look at the different industries that men and women tend to gravitate towards, men are often doing jobs that are dangerous, have worse hours and worse work conditions, really just aren't that pleasant. While women gravitate towards different jobs. They're often teachers, working in social work, working in healthcare, working in things where they're with people and are doing things they find at least find some fulfillment in, or feel like they have some value. Men are often working in prisons or in fishing boats and coal mines. Men suffer almost all workplace fatalities, and the overwhelming majority of workplace injuries are suffered by men. So these are all factors that contribute to the wage gap. And then at the end of it, if you control for all those things, you have a few cents, and it varies on jobs and on specialties, but there is often a few unexplained percentages, but difference between men and women. And that's worth, that means that discrimination is probably contributing to that. There may be other factors that are hard to capture, but discrimination could be driving a little bit of that. That's why it's important for us to have conversations, to encourage women who do feel discriminated against to come forward, for women to ask for raises. There's some suggestion that the women may be more reticent to ask for raises than men. It's important for women to be aware of that so they can be their best advocates. But again, the solution is not. I feel like it's important not to paint some of the rhetoric you hear around this makes it sound as though in America there's overwhelming discrimination against women and we need government to come in and kind of crack down on this. Well, that can be, that's not going to work. And secondly, it has a lot of terrible consequences, or potentially consequences that will work against women. And I think that's really the most important thing to understand about the Paycheck Fairness Act is there are real costs to it. And it's not just, in dollars and cents, but it's also in workplace opportunities.
So if the pay gap then really is the result of women's choices rather than, as you said, the patriarchy smoking cigars in the C-suite, are the proponents of this act and more generally people who keep belaboring this very misleading average wage gap statistic, are they really at war with the patriarchy or the system, or are they really just at odds with the way that women conduct themselves when they're free to choose? In other words, when women make different choices than men about flexibility, about work-life balance, about what kind of job they want, how they want to balance parenting and work. It seems like women, when you get right down to it, women make decisions differently than hardline feminists wish they would make those decisions. Those decisions then contribute to the pay gap. When people then push the pay gap as something to be fixed, what are they really talking about? Are they talking about fixing the choices of the average woman who thinks that she'd rather maybe take a part-time job when she has young children?
Well, absolutely. I do think that there's a lot of frustrations that that women aren't kind of leaning in the way that the feminist organizations and Sheryl Sandberg, instructs us all to, that women do tend to prioritize other things. And it's funny because I feel like from my old days as in women's studies, we used to talk about kind of the male lens or a woman's lens. And really, it seems like a rather, male focused on money as the only thing that matters, and really discounting women's preferences, or saying that the women somehow have the wrong preferences. When in fact, I feel like in many ways, if you look at the women who say, I like having a job that's close to home, or that I'm working with people hands-on, I'm willing to take lower pay so that I can do something, that I can be home with my kids at 4:00. I don't know that those women at the end of the day are going to regret that they focused on other things than maximizing that last dollar that they earned. So I do think that there's a little bit of a disconnect there. But I think that this is probably driven by people who like to continue to kind of beat the drum of equal pay for their own political reasons. But this is also, I do think the big winners from the Paycheck Fairness Act would be lawyers. And that's really, I think, something that's important to recognize. Lawyers are an important and influential kind of lobbying institution or kind of political force. This bill would change what it really does when it gets down to it. Is it makes it easier for lawsuits to move forward as class action lawsuits, so that right now you have to opt in to a class action lawsuit against your employer, where this would require that you opt out, so that you could kind of unknowingly be put in a class action lawsuit against your employer. It also increases the payouts. It makes it so that you have more of an incentive to sue. Which again is, it may sound fine if you're thinking about somebody who has discrimination, but from an employer, especially, a lot of these employers, they're made up of a lot of people that are trying to do their best by each other. This means that a lot of them are going to be more worried about hiring. It's a reason to try to avoid hiring employees, particularly women. And then it changes how employers can defend themselves, or what is an allowable reason for having different pay. And right now they can talk about business necessity. This is the idea that imagine that you have an employee, really valuable employee, who comes in and says, "Hey, I'm going to take this other job unless you match this new salary." Well, that would be something you could use. An employer could say, "No, I'm not discriminating against him. To keep Joe or whoever, I had to give him a raise to keep him from leaving." That this would basically make it look as though that would create a new standard, so that the only way an employer could defend against that is to say that there was no alternative option. And so that's, what does that mean? What is that going to mean in practice and litigation? This is something I think that a lot of times people who are making policies they probably haven't been a manager. They haven't had to make hiring decisions. They haven't kind of put on the shoes of an employer who's balancing all these different, trying to do right by their employees, trying to run a business, trying to provide value to customers. There's a lot going on. And when you have a regulator coming in that says, hey, any pay discrepancy between a man and a woman means that you are going to, you face this enormous potential liability. Well, as an employer, I am an employer. I'm running the Independent Women's Forum. We have employees. And instead of saying, hey, okay, somebody has a new baby or a young child that they want to reduce their work hours for, or have additional flexibility, or limit their amount of travel they have to do in return for lower compensation, I'm going to say, sorry, every title that has this is going to be paid this, and I can't negotiate because I can't have the potential for somebody to sue based on discrimination or try to claim discrimination. That would be a tremendous step backwards for women who value flexibility and value having different opportunities and the ability to design their work lives differently depending on their circumstances. So I think that's really important, that the stakes of this, women have a lot to lose from this, and it's really regulators and lawyers who have the most to gain. But that's really not. I don't think that's coming through in most of the press discussion.
Absolutely. Sounds like the Paycheck Fairness Act is more about lawyers getting a payout than about helping the average working woman. Carrie, thank you so much for being with us today. Just a reminder to all our listeners, thanks for listening. This is the Independent Women's Forum podcast. I'm Inez Stepman. This is our fearless leader, Carrie Lucas. Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by IWF.org for similar content.